questions without notice. The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to an interview in which Australian of the Year Grace Tame has said that after her powerful acceptance speech at the awards ceremony, the Prime Minister leant over and, I quote, said, he leant over and right in my ear he goes, "Well, gee, I bet it felt good to get that out." Can the Prime Minister confirm that that was his response to this brave woman's extraordinary speech?
The Prime Minister has the call.
And I would agree. It was indeed a very brave speech, Mr Speaker, and that I can't recall the exact words I used, Mr Speaker, but I wouldn't seem to correct in any way, shape or form what Ms Tame has said. That is roughly my recollection. And that was a very brave statement, and that's exactly what I meant when I said that to her on that occasion. It was a very proud moment for her and her great struggle and challenge over a long period of time. And what she did on that occasion was speak with a very strong voice about what had occurred to her, Mr Speaker, and I think in raising her voice in that way it would have given great agency to so many victims of sexual abuse and harassment all around this country. And that is exactly what I meant, Mr Speaker, exactly what I meant, and I don't know why some other meaning may have been put upon those words, Mr Speaker.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government's plan for economic recovery is working, especially for regional communities across Australia like the New South Wales Central Coast and Hunter Valley?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for her question and her great advocacy and championing of jobs on the Central Coast, and not just there, but all up through the Central Coast and Hunter, Mr Speaker. Her champion of small business on the Central Coast and the investments that they're making, and importantly her championing of seeing young families especially on the Central Coast getting in their first home. And that's why the member for Robertson has been so supportive of the policies that has seen all of those things occurring under this government, Mr Speaker. First of all, jobs. Unemployment rate has fallen, Mr Speaker, to 5.5% on the most recent figures, and we welcome the fact that unemployment is falling in this country. We particularly welcome the fact also that underemployment has fallen, Mr Speaker, to its lowest level since 2014. Mr Speaker, we welcome the fact that youth unemployment has fallen to its lowest level in 12 years, Mr Speaker. Some 300,000 jobs and more coming back after those jobs were so terribly lost through the COVID-19 pandemic recession, Mr Speaker, and we welcome the fact that 150,000 additional apprentices have been coming on as part of the new programs we're putting in place to support apprentices around the country, which are particularly supporting apprenticeship places up in the Central Coast and up in the Hunter, where I've had the opportunity to visit on so many occasions this year and seeing those policies having their effect. And this is being made possible because we're supporting businesses, small and large, Mr Speaker, with lower taxes, which means that they can invest more, and with targeted programs, whether it be to develop new science and technology and new research and development, or simply a lower tax rate, Mr Speaker, and the instant asset write-off, which we have seen people investing around the country. I was up at Star Scientific, where they're investing in new hydrogen technology, Mr Speaker. I've been up in extreme engineering in Gladstone, where $1.8 million, as the member will know, $1.8 million on a new crane so they can implement their latest contract working with the Bureau of Meteorology. Aquaterra out in Pakenham, Mr Speaker, defence contractors. Planet Innovation up in Box Hill, Mr Speaker, where they're investing in new medical equipment manufacturing capabilities, all being made possible, Mr Speaker, by the instant asset write-off. And of course in the Hunter, expanding the Newcastle Airport, investing in a new gas-fired power plant in Kurri Kurri, Mr Speaker, to keep electricity prices down, and keep the Tomago aluminium smelter open, Mr Speaker, so the jobs in that smelter continue, just like the jobs in the smelter at Portland, Mr Speaker, where I was with the member to ensure that this government is backing in jobs. They're backing in investment in regional parts of the country, and particularly up in the Central Coast and the Hunter, where I know the member is most focused, Mr Speaker.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer confirm that more than 30,000 Australians lost their jobs in April, 64,000 people gave up looking for work altogether, and for those who were fortunate enough to keep their jobs, the budget papers confirm this government will deliver a cut to their real wages?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, it's quite alarming to get a question from the shadow of a shadow Treasurer after he went into witness protection on the day the unemployment numbers came out, because the unemployment rate came down, Mr Speaker. It came down to 5.5%. And, Mr Speaker, 33,800 new full-time jobs were created, Mr Speaker. And the underemployment rate came to its lowest level in 7 years, Mr Speaker. And the youth unemployment rate was the lowest level in 12 years, Mr Speaker. And the member for Rankin was nowhere to be seen because he didn't read the ABS. He didn't read the ABS release. And the ABS said in their statement on the day that even with the end of JobKeeper, had no discernible impact, Mr Speaker, on the employment numbers between March and April. So the member for Rankin has shown himself to be the economic novice we all know he is, Mr Speaker. He's got no credibility. Because this is what the member for Rankin said would happen with the end of JobKeeper. Cutting JobKeeper will have diabolical consequences for workers and small businesses. Wait for it. This is what the member for Rankin said.
The Treasurer will resume his seats.
Which job do you want, Jim?
Members on both sides. The member for Rankin on a point of order.
Relevance, Mr Speaker. The Treasurer was asked for about 30,000 people for whom this does have a discernible impact. 30,000 people lost their job and you're laughing about it.
I just haven't called the Treasurer yet. The Treasurer will just pause. Just say to the member for Rankin, the question asked about that and some other matters as well. I think the Treasurer is being relevant on the policy topic. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, we're laughing at the shadow of a shadow Treasurer, the member for Rankin, Mr Speaker, because not even the Leader of the Opposition has confidence in the shadow Treasurer. He had to get the member for Corai to take on the new portfolio. The reality is the day the unemployment numbers came out, the member for Rankin went into witness protection because he's embarrassed by his own words, Mr Speaker. He's embarrassed by his own words and the diabolical consequences. The harsh reality for the member for Rankin is that his prophecies of doom did not eventuate, Mr Speaker. That in the month of April, the unemployment rate came down to 5.5%, came down. 33,800 new full-time jobs were created. The underemployment rate fell to its lowest level in 7 years, and the youth unemployment rate fell to its lowest level in 20 years. Mr Speaker, we on this side of the House are championing the cause of job creation. We on this side of the House are pleased when more Australians get into jobs. The only people who are commiserating with more people in work is the Leader of the Opposition and the shadow of a shadow Treasurer, the member for Rankin.
The member for New England.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the McCormack-Morrison government plans for economic recovery through the additional investment in local roads and community infrastructure program, and how it's working to drive jobs and economic activity across regional Australia, especially the Hunter Valley, where we had a spectacular win on the weekend?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
I thank the member for New England for his question, Mr Speaker. And he, like me, on Saturday would have heard people coming up to him and talking about jobs, talking about resources, talking about agriculture, talking about all the things that we care on this side of the House and that they don't care about on that side of the
Members
Parliament.
on my left.
Indeed. In the member for New England's electorate, under the Local Roads and Community Infrastructure program, his councils are benefiting, as are the 527 other councils right across Australia from that particular program. A very effective program, making sure that we get the money out there for the roads, making sure that we get the money out there for that vital infrastructure which means such a difference, particularly in the regions, particularly in the member for New England's electorate, particularly in the Hunter. Now, Armidale Regional Council, $6 million under that LRCI program. Glen Innes, $3.4 million. Gwyder, $4.4. Inverell, $5.5. Liverpool Plains, $3.3. Tamworth, $11.3 million. Tenterfield, $4 million. Uralla Shire, 2.3, Walker 2.2 and Upper Hunter Shire Council, $4.8 million. A total of $47.7 million going into the member for New England's electorate, and he would have heard on the weekend how important that money is, what it's going
Members
to
on
do
my left.
to transform. That's very right on the left. They are very left, Mr Speaker, and that's just the trouble. They are very left.
The Deputy Prime Minister will not verbal me.
I will not, Mr Speaker. I would never think of doing such a thing. But don't just take my word for it. Don't just take the member for New England's word for it. Let's hear from the Upper Hunter Shire Mayor, Maury Collison, who said Council could not undertake these sort of community projects without financial backing. It's a big investment in Murrurundi sports and heritage, which are amongst the town's biggest attractions. These are vital regional connections, and working with the state and federal governments, and thankfully I'll just add in there that they're both coalition governments, he said, I am pleased to see our council being able to undertake these much-needed road upgrades. And indeed, and I'm asked, what are the alternatives?
No, I just say to the Deputy Prime Minister, you might have expected to be asked that, but you actually weren't.
Well, Mr Speaker, the proof is in the pudding. We're backing those areas. We're backing those regions. We're backing those resources. And even to use the member for Hunter's own words, you lot need to wake up to yourself.
Members on both sides. The Leader of the Opposition.
Mike.
The Deputy Prime Minister will cease interjecting.
You're right.
The
Finish.
Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. This morning, Senate estimates was told that more than 2 years after the reported sexual assault of Brittany Higgins in this building, there have been no changes in the way this building responds to serious incidents, and none of the reviews that the Prime Minister ordered have concluded. Despite everything we've heard from Ms Higgins, how can that be so?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The member would be aware that while it is not in the purview of the President of the Senate, what was initiated very soon after the reporting of these events was the new counselling service that operates for all members and senators of this place, Mr
Members
Speaker.
on my left.
Expanded hours of access to those supports. That was in place, Mr Speaker, and I'm pleased to report that that service is being well used by staff members of this place, Mr Speaker, where they need to, also by members of parliament and others who are seeking support from those services. And I'm pleased that's in place. That was put in place very soon after, Mr Speaker. Now, in addition, Mr Speaker, I am expecting very, very shortly a report from the Deputy Secretary, who I understand is very close to finalising her report to me, and that matter will then be raised with Cabinet, Mr Speaker, in terms of the recommendations that come forward, and I look forward to engaging with the opposition on the establishment of an independent complaints process. There's some significant work is being done there by my department, working actually closely with the Sex Discrimination Commissioner to ensure that an independent complaints process won't have to wait till the end of this year when the independent inquiry is completed, but we can get that independent process in place much sooner than that. And I look forward to engaging with the opposition on those matters, Mr Speaker, in the very near future.
The member for Indi.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Widespread COVID vaccination is crucial to keeping Australians safe. I represent a border community that suffered enormously from the New South Wales and Victorian border closures last year. The Prime Minister's recent comments about a vaccine passport for interstate travel have alarmed my constituents. Such a passport would impose extraordinary hardship on our community once again. Can the Prime Minister give an ironclad guarantee that his government will not require vaccine passports for interstate travel?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. The proposal that has been raised in the media, Mr Speaker, and I look forward to—
Members on my left.
I was responding to questions in the media about this matter, Mr Speaker, and I responded to those questions. A proposal will be discussed at the next meeting of National Cabinet. But let me be very clear. When I was in Western Australia, the first task was to ensure we continue with the process of vaccinating Australians, and I was pleased last week that was the first time we'd reached 500,000 in a week, 100,000 in a single day, Mr Speaker, and early this week we expect to be around over half on first doses of the population over 70, Mr Speaker, and we welcome that and we will continue to press on. But, Mr Speaker, the proposal we're talking about is not that someone would require a passport to get from one state to another. Not at all, Mr Speaker, not at all. The proposal actually was put to me by the President of the AMA when I was in Western Australia, and I was meeting with him at the time, and he suggested to me, Mr Speaker, that in the event that states
members on my left
in place border restrictions like the member would have experienced between Victoria and New South Wales, that had states put those in place, then it would be very helpful that if people who had been fully vaccinated would be exempt from those restrictions and would be able to move across the borders where, in the extreme circumstances where border restrictions were put in place, that they would be able to move freely across those borders. Now, I would have hoped that that would be a good suggestion, particularly for those living in border communities where they had been fully vaccinated, and in the rather extreme situation, if border arrangements were put in place by state governments, not by the federal government, but if it was the state government putting in place a border restriction, then it was suggested to me, Mr Speaker, that we will consider it.
Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The Prime Minister's concluded his answer. The Prime Minister's concluded his answer. The member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House how the Morrison government's economic plan continues to generate more jobs for all Australians, especially young people and those living in rural and regional areas throughout Australia? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Bass for her question. The former Mayor of Georgetown, a farmer, Mr Speaker, and a very strong advocate for the people of Bass. Now, the Prime Minister and I had the opportunity to go and join the member for Bass at Hillwood Berries recently in the member's electorate, and to meet with the Dorner family, a family-run business, employs 45 people that are expanding their 40-hectare berry farm to over 50 hectares with the advantage of the immediate expensing provisions that we put in the budget. And it's a project that they said will help create more jobs and that they wouldn't have undertaken for up to another 2 years but for that immediate expensing provision. Now, Mr Speaker, the economic plan for Australia to create more jobs was laid out in the budget just a couple of weeks ago. And that was an economic plan that has already seen 500,000 jobs being created since last October's budget, and Australia being the first of any major advanced economy in the world to see more people employed today than they were at the start of the pandemic. And that plan includes tax cuts for more than 10 million Australian families. That plan includes immediate expensing provisions to allow businesses to write off new plant, equipment and machinery. That plan also includes a 10-year, $110 billion infrastructure pipeline. That plan also includes $2.7 billion for 170,000 new apprentices. That plan will help create another 250,000 jobs, Mr Speaker. And we saw the unemployment rate come down to 5.5%, even with the end of JobKeeper. It showed the resilience in the Australian labour market, with 33,800 new full-time jobs being created. But while we on this side of the House had faith in the resilience and strength of the labour market and the ability to end JobKeeper, which was an emergency payment. The other side of politics, Mr Speaker, those on the other side of the House wanted to keep extending that emergency spending measure. This is what the member for Rankin said using his crystal ball. Cutting JobKeeper will have diabolical consequences for workers and small businesses, and he said the jobs that people rely on to feed their loved ones, Mr Speaker. The member for Rankin thought there would be famine across Australia with the end of JobKeeper, Mr Speaker. Then you had the Leader of the Opposition, who said the end of JobKeeper was the only support that was keeping the economic roof from crashing down, Mr Speaker. Well, the only thing that came crashing down with the end of JobKeeper was the Leader of the Opposition's economic credibility, or whatever he thought he had, Mr Speaker. The reality was it was an emergency payment. It helped save millions of Australian jobs, but it had to come to an end, and we held firm and brought it to an end.
The member for Chifley.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the government's own budget papers forecast a cut to real wages over the next 4 years, and for a manufacturing worker, that amounts to a cut in real wages of about $7,800. How do you rack up $1 trillion of debt yet still cut workers' wages?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, I'm surprised to get a question from the member for Chifley about wages when real wages went down in Labor's last year in office, Mr Speaker. Real wages went down in Labor's last year in office. Now, Mr Speaker, wages are forecast to grow 1.25% through the year to the June quarter. But as I said to the House just 2 weeks ago, Mr Speaker, the CPI is expected to be 3.5% in the June quarter for 2021. The reason being that in the previous year we saw the steepest quarterly fall in the CPI since 1931, off the back of particular measures that were introduced in the middle of COVID, like free childcare, Mr Speaker. We saw cheaper rents, Mr Speaker, and we also saw cheaper petrol. That was the reason why we saw inflation go negative in that year, Mr Speaker, and that is why we saw those results with respect to real wages. But we will see wages increase to 2.75% over the forecast horizon period 24-25. But, Mr Speaker, what we are seeking to do is allow Australians to keep more of their hard-earned money, right? With a tax relief that we have put in the budget, with more than 10 million Australians getting tax relief. Mr Speaker, we will drive policies that will see more Australians in work. We will drive policies that will help bring the unemployment rate lower. That will help drive real wages up, and we are helping Australians get more of their hard-earned money with the tax relief that we support on this side of the House, and which the others on the other side of the House want to bet each way.
The member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House how the Morrison government keeps delivering on its promises to cut taxes for hard-working Australians and their families, and to let them keep more of what they earn? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Sturt for his question, acknowledge his experience both in the private sector and working for the Marshall government, Mr Speaker, and I had the opportunity to join the member for Sturt in his electorate recently to visit a great cheese-making business, Casa della Formaggio, Mr Speaker. Casa della Formaggio, Mr Speaker. It started 33 years ago, Claude and his mum and his dad, just three of them, and today it employs more than 160 people, Mr Speaker. And Claude is using the immediate expensing provisions to expand his business, like so many businesses across South Australia and indeed across the country. Now, in the budget just 2 weeks ago, there were substantial measures to provide more tax relief to hard-working Australian families and to businesses, like the extension of the low and middle-income tax offset for more than 10 million Australian families, like the extension of the immediate expensing provisions that will cover around $320 billion of investment, as well as the loss carry-back measures being extended for another year, like the patent box, Mr Speaker, and I had the opportunity to visit the member for Bennelong and to see how the patent box will help businesses like Cochlear with innovation and commercialisation in Australia. And the members on this side of the House are pleased to know that through policies we have supported, the company tax rate for businesses with a turnover of under $50 million will be reduced to just 25 cents in the dollar from the 1st of July this year. Now, we've also legislated through the parliament stage 3 of our tax relief, Mr Speaker, the 3-stage tax plan, which will see the abolition of a full tax bracket, the 37 cents in the dollar tax bracket, and which will see 95% of Australian taxpayers pay a marginal rate of no more than 30 cents in the dollar, Mr Speaker. One big tax bracket from $45,000 to $200,000. Now, the Leader of the Opposition said in March that by the budget he would tell us their position on stage 3 tax cut. He said he had to see the state of the budget. He said he would tell us, but he hasn't, Mr Speaker. Now, the member for Rankin tells us that he's in no rush, he's no big fan. He's no big fan of the legislated tax cuts. But then to add to the confusion, Mr Speaker, we have the member for Corio who is out there, Mr Speaker, saying on the weekend that Labor won't stand in the way of anyone and their tax cut. The member for Corio, Labor won't stand in the way of anyone and their tax cut. Well, Mr Speaker, if they don't stand in the way of anyone and their tax cut, they will back stage 3 of the legislated tax cuts, Mr Speaker. And the member for Hotham, out there on Insiders had another idea about tax. Mr Speaker, so many different policies from those opposite, but only this side of the House supports lower taxes for hard-working Australian families.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The government's own budget papers forecast a cut to real wages over the next 4 years. For a worker in education and training, that amounts to a cut in real wages of around $8,200. How do you rack up $1 trillion of debt, yet still cut workers' wages?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There are more people in work today, Mr Speaker, than there were before the pandemic hit. This country has gone through the worst economic crisis we have seen since the Great Depression. But unlike so many other countries around the world, Mr Speaker, unlike so many other countries around the world, only Australia stands alone amongst so many advanced economies in being able to demonstrate the resurgence of our economy and our labour market in particular, Mr Speaker, as more and more and more Australians get back into work. Now, it's not by accident, Mr Speaker, because we know that as more and more people get back into work, then that creates tightness in the labour market, which ultimately, Mr Speaker, ensures that wages can grow again. But it's not just the only reason why wages will grow, Mr Speaker. When you encourage businesses to invest in productivity, when you encourage them through the instant asset write-off, and when you encourage them with the multitude of tax incentives to invest in research and development, to invest in their manufacturing capabilities, as we are through the Modern Manufacturing Initiative. What that has shown, Mr Speaker, in works that has been done by Accenture is that the average tax rate, the tax rate, Mr Speaker, on new investment in Australia today, it's not 30%. It's not 25%, Mr Speaker. It's 21%, Mr Speaker. And what that means is Australian businesses investing in the plant and equipment, which lifts the productivity of their workers, Mr Speaker, means that they can earn more. But it goes beyond that, because they won't just, Mr Speaker, benefit from a growing economy and their own employers investing in their businesses so they can earn more. They can keep more of what they earn under a Liberal national government, Mr Speaker, because those opposite we know. We've seen the cat bell down in Victoria. What's the first thing the Labor government wanted to do in Victoria? Increase taxes, Mr Speaker, at the first opportunity. That's the Labor way. That's the Labor way. The Coalition's way, Mr Speaker, is to lower taxes, Mr Speaker, to keep taxes low so Australian businesses can invest, so Australians can keep more of what they earn, so they can save for their first home. We've got first home ownership at the highest level, Mr Speaker, in 11 years. In 11 years, Mr Speaker, because we're allowing Australians to get ahead. We believe if they have a go, they'll get a go, Mr Speaker, and under our policies they are getting that go. The businesses who employ them are getting that go, Mr Speaker. What they'll get from those opposite, as we know, as is their form, Mr Speaker, is higher taxes and higher taxes from Labor.
The member for Lyne.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-McCormack government's plan for Australian families and businesses to have access to affordable, reliable energy that they rely on is working in our regions, like the Hunter Valley, where David Lazell of the New South Wales Nationals had a really good victory on the weekend? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lyne for his important question and for his steadfast commitment to affordable, reliable energy for the households and businesses in his electorate, Mr Speaker. And he knows, as we all do on this side of this place, that our plan is working. An 11% retail price reduction in electricity prices across Australia in the last 12 months, Mr Speaker. The lowest prices we've seen since the carbon tax was removed, put in place by those opposite alongside their mates in the Greens, Mr Speaker. Now, he also knows how important it is to put downward pressure on prices for those 900,000 Australian workers working in the manufacturing sector, Mr Speaker, including at places like the Tomago aluminium smelter just outside his electorate, Mr Speaker. And that's why, when Liddell closes, the Liddell Power Station closes in the Hunter Valley in 2023, we'll be replacing it with a 660 megawatt gas-fired generator at Kurri, Mr Speaker. We won't risk prices or reliability when Liddell leaves, because we know what happens without adequate replacement, Mr Speaker. Now, that's good news for households and businesses right across the East Coast, Mr Speaker. The Hunter Power Project will keep the lights on and will drive prices down, and that's good news for jobs, Mr Speaker. 600 direct construction jobs, 1,200 indirect jobs, and most important of all, Mr Speaker, the ongoing jobs of those customers like the 1,000 people working at the Tomago smelter and the many thousands of others who are dependent on that operation. Now, Mr Speaker, there's plenty of support for this plan. The Chief Executive of Tomago says it's absolutely essential. The Australian Workers' Union, no less. This announcement means the creation of hundreds of quality jobs, Mr Speaker. And the member for Hunter, who's been very busy over the last few days talking the project up, and he says it's unequivocally a good idea. Good on him. The only way, he says, that we can fill the gap left by Liddell. And the member for Patterson, she says, I'm not backing down on this one, Mr Speaker. Not backing down on this one. Now, I was asked about alternative approaches, and the truth is Labor has no plan. No plan for energy in this country, no plan for jobs in the Hunter Valley, no plan for the replacement of the Liddell Power Station, Mr Speaker, and we saw what the people of the Hunter Valley thought of that over the weekend, Mr Speaker. The New South Wales Labor leader, Jodie Mackay, asked a very important question. She said, workers aren't voting for us, she said. Why aren't workers voting for us, Mr Speaker? Well, the answer is just over there, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition, the member for Hindmarsh and now the member for McMahon. Same old Labor.
The member for Dobell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The government's own budget papers forecast a cut to real wages over the next 4 years. For a worker in healthcare and social assistance, that amounts to a cut in real wages of around $6,900. How do you rack up $1 trillion of debt yet still cut workers' wages?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. This budget is about driving more people into work, Mr Speaker, creating more jobs and therefore getting more competition for Labor and therefore delivering higher real wages, Mr Speaker. And the reality is real wages under our government are higher than they were under Labor, Mr Speaker. Indeed, in Labor's last year in office, real wages fell, Mr Speaker. And today the unemployment rate at 5.5% is lower than when we came to government. That was after a recession. Now, Mr Speaker, I explained earlier that with respect to real wages in 2021, that was a function of particular policies that helped drive better outcomes for Australian families with free childcare, with lower rents, with cheaper petrol, which saw the consumer price index have its steepest fall since 1931, Mr Speaker, which then meant that the inflation rate was higher in 2021, and that has meant that the inflation rate has been above wages growth for that year. But, Mr Speaker, as I said, real wages continue to increase. Wages are forecast, while they're forecast at 1.25% through the year to June quarter 2021, they're upgraded to 1.5% through the year to June quarter 2022. They reach 2.75% over the forecast horizon 24-25. But, Mr Speaker, the way to enable more Australians to keep more of their hard-earned money is to support the tax relief that we have legislated through this parliament. And if the honourable member wants to support Australians keeping more of their hard-earned money, then they should support our stage 3 of the legislated tax plan, which will see somebody on $80,000, Mr Speaker, $900 better off, Mr Speaker. Somebody on $90,000, $1,120 better off. Someone on $100,000, $1,370 better off. That will be the amount, Mr Speaker, that Australians will be worse off if the Labor Party ever got their way and walked away from the stage 3 of our tax plan.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's plan for our defence industry works by creating more jobs and backing Australian businesses, including in our regions? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Lindsay for her question and thank her for her support for the local defence industry, but also more broadly for support for the manufacturing sector in her electorate. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is investing a record $270 billion in our defence capabilities, delivering jobs right across the nation. And, Mr Speaker, we say to the men and women in uniform, the men and women in our ADF, that we have your back. Mr Speaker, our record speaks for itself. Ambitious shipbuilding in Henderson and in Adelaide, next-gen army vehicles being built in Queensland, creating many jobs across the country, F-35 sustainment hub in regional New South Wales, and a record defence industry capabilities being built right across the nation. Our record speaks for itself. Sadly, Mr Speaker, Labor's record also speaks for itself, shamefully gutting $18 billion from its defence budget. Mr Speaker, in stark contrast, we're not only delivering record investment in our defence force, we're delivering record opportunities for regional Australia to play a very, very important role in the defence of our nation. And nowhere, Mr Speaker, is that clearer than in the Hunter Valley. In a recent trip to the Hunter, Mr Speaker, where I spoke at the Hunter Defence Annual Conference, I had the great pleasure of launching the Getting Defence Ready pilot between Defence and HunterNet. Over the next 14 months, training courses will be offered free of charge to build up the skills of those local Hunter SMEs in the region to help better position them to be ready to be able to win those very important defence contracts. Mr Speaker, we've also announced to local contractors in the Hunter region that they'll receive a boost of some $42.2 million worth of overhaul of facilities at the iconic Singleton military base. The Singleton mid-term facility refresh will improve amenities for more than the 1,000 ADF and the civilian personnel at the base, Mr Speaker, with some 650 local Aussie jobs being supported during that construction period. Mr Speaker, our investment in Singleton show that defence industry is not just about the shipbuilders or the engineers that are building out those very important ships and the military vehicles. The local tradies, the local earth-moving contractors, those local family-owned small SME building companies that are working on those major infrastructure projects, they are also a critical part of Australia's growing defence industry, and we're very grateful to them. Mr Speaker, under Labor, investment in defence dropped to its lowest level that we've seen since World War II. And I think the result on the weekend in the Upper Hunter is hardly surprising, Mr Speaker, given that Labor is drifting away very, very quickly from regional Australia. On this side of the House, we're backing regional
time
jobs,
has
regional
concluded.
business.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that, as well as cutting real wages over the next 4 years, his government has also refused to back an increase to the minimum wage, has cut penalty rates, and has also intervened in a High Court case to rip away pay from long-term workers in insecure work? How do you rack up $1 trillion of debt yet still be so determined to cut workers' wages?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, I don't accept the assertions put forward by the member who came with a dispatch box on these issues, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the submissions that were made by the government to the Fair Work process are the same as have been made by the government over many years, Mr Speaker. In fact, Mr Speaker, and they reflect exactly the same submissions that were also put forward by the previous government, Mr Speaker, including during the GFC, Mr Speaker, where they made similar observations regarding the impact on the labour market at a time of economic crisis, Mr Speaker. But I do note, Mr Speaker, that it was the practice under the member for Maribyrnong, when it related to those processes, that the Labor Party would make submissions to that Fair Work process, Mr Speaker. Not so under this Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. So this Leader of the Opposition is so keen, Mr Speaker, to talk about these issues out there, but when it comes to actually submitting a case, Mr Speaker, once again he has a bet each way.
The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the Minister inform the House how the Morrison government's manufacturing plan is working to back regional manufacturers, helping to create and secure jobs? And most importantly, Mr Speaker, is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
All right. Well, I wouldn't agree that's the most important thing, but I'll hear from the Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And of course, the member knows, as the government does, the special importance that manufacturing has in our regional and rural areas. And in fact, the member is well aware there are 4,000 people alone in his electorate employed in manufacturing, that it's our 6th largest industry, employs over 900,000 people, and that actually represents, that latest figure, an increase of about 50,000 people since the COVID-induced challenges. So we are back at essentially parity in the manufacturing centre as we were before COVID. And of course, the member knows that manufacturing as a percentage is actually higher in our regions, with up to 14% of the workforce employed in manufacturing in some Australian regions, and about 31% of the manufacturing jobs, about 266,000 Australians, employed in our regions. And it was for that reason, Mr Speaker, that in March of this year the Prime Minister was in the Hunter region, visiting a really great Australian manufacturing business, Energy Renaissance. They are on the cutting edge with the manufacture of lithium-ion batteries. And the reason the Prime Minister was there was to announce our resources, technology and critical minerals processing manufacturing roadmap. This government has committed $1.5 billion to expand manufacturing activity and create jobs across 6 priority areas. We've also backed our manufacturing system with the modern manufacturing strategy, which is an additional $2 billion in R&D incentives, and roughly a quarter of the projects, when you look at them, under the first round of our modern manufacturing modernisation fund, were in regional areas. And a specific focus of that fund has been in resources, technology and critical minerals. And one example, Mr Speaker, of one of the recipients of the Modern Manufacturing Fund Round 1 was a company called Howard Mining Systems in New South Wales. They received funding to purchase a 3D industrial printer, a water jet cutter machine and sheet metal folding machine, which will allow them to develop an integrated one-stop shop to design, prototype and manufacture technically advanced niche product solutions for mining and heavy industrial applications. The global mining equipment market is expected to reach about $166 billion by 2027, and this government is committed to making sure that manufacturing grows alongside our mineral resources industry in secondary processing and production, but also in the manufacture of mining equipment. And I was asked whether there are any alternative approaches. One of the difficulties for members opposite is it is actually very hard to grow secondary industries around mineral resources and mining, or mining equipment manufacture, if you can't decide whether or not you actually support the minerals industry in the first place. If you can't decide whether or not you support taking the minerals out of the ground, it becomes very, very hard to support secondary processing and manufacture.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister give a straight answer on when Australians will be fully vaccinated against COVID-19?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I thank the member for his question. As I said earlier during the question time period, Mr Speaker, last week, for the first time, we reached 500,000 vaccines doses delivered in a week. Last week we also saw 100,000 in a day, Mr Speaker, which is a marked improvement on where we've been in recent weeks. Mr Speaker, we've got two-thirds, Mr Speaker, of those vaccine doses being administered by GPs. And early this week we expect more than half, Mr Speaker, of the over 70s population to be vaccinated with their first dose. Now, Mr Speaker, as the Minister for Health indicated on the weekend, we anticipate, based on Pfizer contractual arrangements and the information that they've provided them, that we should have sufficient doses, Mr Speaker, in the third and fourth quarter of this year to be able to ramp up those processes to ensure that we make significant progress by the end of this year. Now, Mr Speaker, we have a population that is eligible for vaccination of just over about 20 million, Mr Speaker. I do note that in other countries around the world they're sitting around after many weeks, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, I know we're halfway through. It goes to relevance. It was a very straight question which asked for a straight answer on when Australians will be fully vaccinated against COVID-19.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Again, this grandstanding continues from the Leader of the Opposition. He's been warned about it before. He gets up here to get a grab for the TV night.
The Leader of the House.
This may be a going out of business sale for him. I don't know, Mr
will resume
Speaker.
his seat. Members on my left aren't helping me rule on the point of order. I'm presuming the Prime Minister has not finished his answer. No. So I'm just rule on the point of order. No, I'll just say to those opposite, I mean, you can sort of keep arguing across the dispatch boxes, but it doesn't allow me to rule on the point of order. The Leader of the Opposition is quite right. It was a very specific question without a preamble. The Prime Minister's been entitled to some context, which he had in the opening remarks, which is why I enabled him to do that. But it is now the time to come to the specifics of the question to be relevant to it. The Prime Minister has the call.
Based on what the Health Minister has said on the weekend, Mr Speaker, and what we understand to be the supplies and when they'd be delivered, we hope to be in a position by the end of the year when all Australians who would wish to be vaccinated would have had the opportunity for that first dose, Mr Speaker. But that is also subject to many variables that are outside the government's control, as those opposite would understand, Mr Speaker. I don't know what planet
Prime
the Leader
Minister
of the
will pause for a
Opposition is
second.
living on,
Members
Mr.
on my
Speaker.
left, the member for Kingston and others, are preventing me from hearing the Prime Minister's answer. The Prime Minister
Thank you,
has
Mr.
the
Speaker.
call.
I don't know what planet the Leader of the Opposition is living on, Mr Speaker, but it's not a planet where pandemic rages around the world, Mr Speaker. This government is dealing with the realities of the global pandemic and the recession that it has caused. And in response to that, Mr Speaker, under our government's policies, Mr Speaker, this country has avoided 30,000 deaths when you compare it to the experience of OECD countries around the world, and there are more Australians in work today than there were before the pandemic, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition wants to go to
the Leader of the
Afghanistan,
Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition has already taken a point of order on relevance. The Prime Minister needs to confine himself to the question, not about other things that have happened in the pandemic.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I've
Prime
concluded
Minister.
my answer.
The member for Mallee has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Assistant Treasurer, Minister for Housing and Minister for Homelessness, Social and Community Housing. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison-McCormack government's plan to help Australians achieve their goal of owning their own home and create more jobs is working for our regions? And is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Housing.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Mallee for her question. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is a government of home ownership, and indeed the Liberal and National parties have always been the parties of home ownership and the parties that fight for first home buyers. And Mr Speaker, because of the measures put in place by the Morrison government, we now see first home buyer levels at their highest for nearly 15 years. First home buyers at their highest levels for nearly 15 years, and indeed the Housing Industry Association has said that to March we'll have 155,000 first home buyers this year in the middle of a pandemic compared to the long-run average of 100,000. Now, Mr Speaker, it doesn't happen by accident. It happens because of a concerted effort from the Morrison government, starting with the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, which enables Australians to purchase their first home with a 5% deposit. It was, of course, built upon by the Home Builder program, which has seen more than 130,000 projects around Australia. It's ignited the residential construction industry in every city, every regional centre, every country town. And in addition to helping the industry, it has meant first home buyers are able to get over that deposit hurdle. And I was very pleased indeed to be with the member for Mallee in Mildura not too long ago, where we met a couple, Jordan and Nick, very representative of young Australians looking to get into their first home around Australia, who told us that there's no way they could have purchased their first home without the Home Builder grant. Now, that's in contrast to the Leader of the Opposition, who said that the Home Builder program would be funding pearl taps and gold baths. Now, I can assure the Leader of the Opposition that Jordan and Nick in Mildura don't have a gold bath. It's just a very, very great first home. And I'd say to members opposite that we built on this great success we've had for first home buyers in the budget. We've put in place a number of additional measures. We've expanded the First Home Super Saver scheme, another scheme opposed by those opposite, which enables people to save a deposit more quickly in superannuation. We expanded the First Home Loan Deposit scheme with new home guarantees, and of course we put in place the Family Home Guarantee to help single parents purchase their first home with a deposit of 2%. So our plan is working. Members opposite have opposed us every step of the way. The geniuses opposite opposed the Home Builder program. The hapless member for Blaxland opposed a program which has helped 130,000 people get into their first home. We are the parties for first home buyers, and we'll continue to do so.
Members for Gilmore and others. The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Commonwealth is receiving 1.4 million doses of COVID vaccine each week. How is it that the government is only putting 500,000 doses per week into people's arms when they're receiving almost 3 times that number in supply?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm delighted to be able to respond to this question. In the last week, what we have seen is a record number of vaccinations, as the Prime Minister has said, 512,000 vaccinations, and indeed 512,916 vaccinations. 2 weeks ago it was 402,000, last week it was 436,000, this week it was 512, and so we distribute, and what we're seeing is that in the last week there were over 960,000 vaccines that were distributed. What that will lead to is the ability of the states and GPs. We also have contingency. Contingency is for second doses. Actually, where one dose is given, a second dose has to be given. Contingency is about provisioning for the second doses. That is actually how it operates. And for every Pfizer dose, a second dose is provisioned. For every AstraZeneca dose, a significant proportion of doses are provisioned, because we do know that in the coming weeks CSL will have line maintenance. So at this point in time, we actually have 2.6 million in contingency to allow for AstraZeneca second doses, to allow for Pfizer second doses, and to allow for the coming line maintenance, which is being done by CSL with their AstraZeneca plan. But having said that, last week was over 960,000 doses delivered. This week we'll have a similar number of doses delivered, and as a consequence of that, what we're doing is we have a 75% utilisation rate. The Commonwealth aged care rate is 100%. We have in the states and territories approximately 75%, as was announced just previously by Commodore Young. And so we thank the states and territories. At this stage, they've delivered 1.27 million doses. The Commonwealth has delivered approximately 2.34 million doses, which includes our GPs, who have in recent days passed the 2 million mark. They have delivered 2,012,000 doses, and in aged and disability care, 326,000 doses. So what we are seeing is that on all of these fronts, people are stepping forward to be vaccinated, and we welcome that. And only prior to question time, Commodore Young, who is leading the Vaccine Operations Centre coordination, announced a further increase in the allocation to GPs who are using more than 80% of their doses, where we will go from 150 to 200 doses, or quadruple what it was recently, from 200 to 300 for medium volume level, or triple what it was recently, or an increase for high volume, high throughput clinics from 400 to 600 doses a week. So as those doses are being provided, as we expand to the over 50s, more Australians are being vaccinated every week.
The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia. Will the Minister outline how the Morrison government's plan for economic recovery is backing our minerals industry and its workers across regional Australia, including North Queensland, and is the Minister aware of any alternatives?
The Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia.
Well, can I thank the honourable member for that question, Mr Speaker? And we've got the bulldog from Flynn and we've got the terrier from Townsville, Mr Speaker, another supporter of the resources sector. And we know why, Mr Speaker, because over 7,000 jobs in the member's electorate relies on the resources sector. 7,000. That's direct and indirect, Mr Speaker. So we know, Mr Speaker, that nickel, copper and zinc heads out through the Townsville port. It's what supports our economy. And we know the resources sector, Mr Speaker, is on track for record exports. Resources and energy, $296 billion. But we are not resting on our laurels, Mr Speaker. We are not resting on our laurels. We intend to make sure there is a pipeline of projects coming through to retain those projects, to retain those jobs in the resources sector. We committed $100 million in tax incentives through the Junior Minerals Exploration Incentive, Mr Speaker, in the budget 2 weeks ago. We've already got money in the Exploring for the Future Fund, and that is ensuring that Geoscience Australia is out there identifying the next Mount Isa, the next Mount Whaleback, the next big find, and that is more jobs, Mr Speaker, inside the resources sector. Now, Mr Speaker, I was in the northwest last week, up at Mount Whaleback, one of Australia's oldest iron ore mines, one of the oldest iron ore mines in the country. Now, what is that doing? Well, it's $136 billion from the iron ore sector. That is a lot of money. Contributes some $8 billion to the WA state government's revenue. That is how we pay for the essential services that Australians rely on, Mr Speaker. Hospitals, roads, schools, all of that other support, supporting 45,000 jobs in the west. Mount Whaleback, Mr Speaker, they tell me the iron ore is such a high quality you can hold two rocks together and tack it with a welder. Just incredible. Been around for more than 50 years. But, Mr Speaker, I am asked about alternatives. Mr Speaker. Well, we heard some alternatives from the member for Hunter this morning. We heard some alternatives. I'd say to the member for Hunter, stand up, line up, join up. We can help you with the New South Wales Nationals. I've got some guidance here for membership, Mr Speaker, if the member for Hunter wants to come on over. If you're serious, Joel, there's an opportunity. But, Mr Speaker, we know that there has been an attempt in recent weeks on a cold pivot from those opposite. The Leader of the Opposition sent out the Shadow Resources Minister, attempting to convince resources workers that they're standing up for them. Well, Mr Speaker, no one believes them. No one believes them. That was absolutely demonstrated on the weekend. But, Mr Speaker, coming back to those alternative options, it would be a shame to see the member for Hunter leave. It would be a shame to see the member for Hunter leave. And I say to the member Hunter, there's some options here for you. You can get across to the member for McMahon's. You can get your head in the wardrobe, wade through the suits, get to the skivvy pile, get to the stack. It doesn't matter what colour it is, Mr Speaker, red, green, blue or yellow. I hear the Wiggles are recruiting. I can see the catch line now. I can see the catch line. Wake up, Albo, wake up.
No, the minister will refer to members by their correct titles.
I withdraw.
Thank you. The member for Maribyrnong.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Page 36 of Budget Paper number 1 states an assumption that most priority populations have been vaccinated. But the Disabilities Royal Commission heard last week that less than 1% of disability care residents, that's 127 people, were fully vaccinated against COVID. This situation has been described by Councillor Sisting as an abject failure. Why does the Prime Minister never take responsibility when he fails to deliver, in this case, to people with a disability?
Has concluded. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I indicated in response to some questions on this matter over the course of the last few days, the initial estimate of the number of vaccinations completed for those in NDIS has been revised based on directly contacting people within the NDIS program, which hadn't been picked up in the earlier reviews, Mr Speaker. So 8,440 vaccinations now, Mr Speaker, have doses have been delivered to people in the
Manager
NDIS.
of Opposition business.
Well, you don't want to know.
Point of order. The Prime Minister. No, members on both sides. I want to hear from the Manager of Opposition business on the point of
just
order.
a point of order on direct relevance. Prime Minister, the question refers specifically to disability care residents. That's who the question's about, not the NDIS generally.
The Prime Minister has the call. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, to the member's point of order, as the Health Minister was just interjecting across the chamber, this relates to NDIS in residential settings, Mr Speaker. So that is 8,440 doses that have been delivered, and that's settings for some 5,855 people. Now, Mr Speaker, I don't think that we're making enough progress quickly here. I don't think we are. And the Minister for the NDIS and I have met together with the Health Minister and the team administering these vaccinations, oversighting, I should say, Mr Speaker, to see the in-reach services better targeted, but as these numbers indicate, far higher than what the figure was that was quoted to the hearing, Mr Speaker, is that people living with a disability find themselves able to access vaccinations in a range of different settings, and we're ensuring by direct contact with those in these settings, Mr Speaker, that we can better target the delivery of those doses to them.
The member for Groom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister inform the House how the Morrison government's significant investment in defence is working in our regions to secure jobs and keep Australians safe? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Defence has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. I thank you very much for his support of the members of the Australian Defence Force and his electorate, particularly at Oakey Air Base. Mr Speaker, it's great to be part of a government that is investing so significantly into our Defence Force. Mr Speaker, not only into our personnel, but into the assets that they need to keep us safe and to make sure that we can put more and more money, Mr Speaker, into infrastructure that is utilised by Defence. Mr Speaker, we have been able to deliver, particularly in regional Australia and including in the Hunter, Mr Speaker, and we've put $1.5 billion into a new air combat capability facilities project. The RAF Williamtown redevelopment stage 2 is a $274 million project. We're investing $66 million to upgrade the Newcastle Airport runway. And, Mr Speaker, these, of course, aren't investments that Labor was able to make. And I recall when the member for Hunter was the Defence Minister in the Rudd years, the glorious Rudd years. You might remember them. The country has never forgotten those years. And his reign as the Minister for Defence would have been a glorious reign, Mr Speaker, but for the fact that Labor cut $18 billion from defence investment. So his frustration with the Labor Party has been long-running, Mr Speaker. The member for Hunter has been consistently frustrated by the Labor Party, including most recently, Mr Speaker. We know that. I mean, imagine had he been able to preside over an investment that we are making into the regions. We are supporting thousands of jobs, Mr Speaker, in the Hunter and across regional and outer metropolitan areas in this country, and people who live there understand that. They know that through the investment we are making, we're not only keeping Australia safe and secure, but we are creating thousands and thousands of jobs in regional areas, in outer metropolitan suburbs. Families know that somebody in their household is able to pay the bills, Mr Speaker, because this government is supporting defence industry. We're supporting the primes, we're supporting those small businesses, Mr Speaker, who are employing those individuals, Mr Speaker, employing those people who otherwise would not have a job. And under Labor, they didn't have a job, Mr Speaker. Funding for defence was at its lowest level since 1938. Mr Speaker, you cannot keep Australia secure, you cannot keep Australia safe if you rip money from the Defence Force, which is exactly what Labor did before and exactly what they would do again.
The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Why did the Health Minister last week give Australians over 50 a wink and a nod that it was okay to wait for an mRNA vaccine later in the year? Were those comments based on health advice?
The Minister for Health has the call.
The statement is false. I'll read exactly the statement.
Members on my left, the Minister has the call.
Let me read exactly the statement, as we have done on every occasion.
Member for Isaacs.
The question: would over 50s concerned about the AstraZeneca jab, this is from the press, be able to access Pfizer or Moderna vaccines later in the year? The answer: during the course of the year we have said repeatedly, as there are larger numbers, over 20 million doses of Pfizer, and now the Moderna supplies that could be available, then there is more than enough to vaccinate every Australian. That's a factual statement that was made on April the 9th, on May the 13th and again on May the 19th. But then the next statement, which seems to have been omitted, was, but right now, and I was just speaking with Professor Brendan Murphy before coming to this, right now we want to encourage everybody over 50 to be vaccinated as early as possible. And the message is very clear. The message is very clear. If you are not vaccinated and you catch COVID, you could die. That's the message, and that's the message to all Australians. And there could not be a clearer message. And this is what we've said right through. Because we know this, that we have vaccines now, we've provisioned for all circumstances, we are seeing an increase in the number of Australians who are coming forward to be vaccinated. We are seeing an correct?
The Leader of the Opposition and the Minister has the call.
What we have done is make sure that we have vaccination now for the over 50s. We have vaccination to cover any circumstances where there is a supply disruption, and we have also adapted to ATAGI advice. And we've been able to do this because we provisioned with contingencies within the contracts last year. Significantly, what does this mean? It means that we've seen 512,000 Australians come forward for vaccination in the last week. It means that we have done everything we can to ensure support, encouragement and confidence in the vaccination program. I would hope that the opposition is going to support confidence in the vaccination program. I would hope that the opposition—
Members on my left.
I would hope that the opposition
The minister will pause for a second.
Inquire.
The minister will pause for a second. The member for Isaacs has already. I've already asked him to stop interjecting. He'll leave under 94A. The minister has the call.
And as I said last week, Mr. Speaker, and as we say now, right now, we want to encourage everybody over 50 to be vaccinated as early as possible. And we want to encourage everybody who's in a qualifying group to be vaccinated as early as possible.
The member for Barara.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government is securing Australia's future by investing in the mental health and well-being of Australian children and families?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Barara, who, along with the member for Fenner, is the co-chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Suicide Prevention. It's something which draws together all members of this House and indeed all members in all parliaments right around Australia. And one particular focus is on the mental health and well-being of young Australians, of children, because we know that, sadly, mental health and suicide are not confined to the adult population. So in that context, one of the central themes in the $2.3 billion National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Plan, which the Treasurer and the Prime Minister put forward on budget night, is protection of children. Last week, I had the privilege of visiting your town in Brisbane with the member for Brisbane. Your town runs Kids Helpline. Kids Helpline provides services to hundreds of thousands of young Australians between 5 and 25. It's extraordinary. Every year. And they played an incredible role during the pandemic, and they kept going and they found ways through. And we were pleased and privileged to be able to support them with $26.8 million for their work in protecting our children from mental health and providing suicide prevention support over the coming 4 years. Indeed, they have an urgent intervention approach which literally saves lives and protects lives, approximately 2,000 urgent interventions where the triage was necessary and put in place where they believed that children were at imminent risk of grievous self-harm, and their work is just something extraordinary. Equally, as part of this, we're developing a national network of mental health hubs around the country, 40 adult head-to-health hubs, expanding Headspace to 164 Headspace hubs for youth, but creating 15 head-to-health kids hubs with a $54 million investment as part of an $820 million investment in treatment centres. This is a game-changer. I hope and I believe in years to come that Head-to-Health Kids will be known in the same way as Headspace, as a trusted, safe space for young Australians to go in times of extremis. And then we've backed that with support for families who are helping children face mental health challenges. $111 million provided by the Treasurer as part of the mental health package for MBS or Medicare items for families to go as groups to help children who are facing crises so as the families are engaged in that treatment. All of these things together are a fundamental part of our national task of saying every child matters, every life matters, and we're going to fight for every one of those lives to help protect them and to save them. And when we see Kids Helpline, we see Headspace, we see Head to Health, and we see the work of our doctors, we say thank you. The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Thanks, yes. Mr. Speaker. I join with the Minister on behalf of this side of the House welcoming the increased investment in mental health, particularly through organisations like Headspace, Head to Health and Kids Helpline. And I pay tribute with the Minister for the incredible work that people on the front line of these services give. It's a really tough job to receive those calls and to put their own mental health at risk by helping others, and we thank them.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and apologies to the member for Kennedy, but other commitments, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure we'll have another opportunity later in the week. I indeed hope. Yes. Mr. Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.